Hello, and thank you very much for coming along once again. This evening we want to look at what's happened in this last week. Rather tragically for both the United States and the world, we're witnessing in effect a new resurgence of the collapse of American leadership on an international scale. It has to do with the implications, global implications, of the Trump decision to withdraw from the Global Climate Accord agreed in Paris in 2015 and implemented through the Marrakesh meetings in 2016. And what we're witnessing basically is a complete isolation of the United States from the rest of the international community, especially the large industrial countries that now realize the United States is not working as an ally with them in any respect. And they're beginning to get quite irritated about it. So we're going to be looking at it in terms of what we're referring to as the cascading collapse of American leadership in world affairs, the aftermath of Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Global Climate Accord. It became quite apparent this week, but it was predicted from the very beginning of June, when he started to indicate he was going to withdraw in a formal way from the Paris Accord, not just not implement it, but actually make a big deal about withdrawing from it. At the time, there were warnings of the consequences well before he made the decision public. CNN talked about the EU chief, that is the head of the European Union, emphasizing that China was ready to fill the US leadership vacuum. Take a look at their report.
In hours, President Trump is expected to make waves, big waves in the global community when we do expect that he will announce this afternoon that the U.S. is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, a move that would isolate the United States from every developed economy in the world when it comes to fighting climate change.
This morning, world leaders are urging, even warning the president to keep the United States in its leadership role. CNN's Frederick Pleiken live in London with some of the remarkable response this morning, Fred.
Yeah, some really remarkable responses, and I can tell you guys from sort of seeing the political climate here in Europe, it is quite charged, and there are a lot of leaders here in Europe who are pleading with the president to stay inside that climate agreement, but there's others who are actually threatening him and the U.S., saying, look, if you do this, you will be isolated internationally. There was the head of the European Commission who came out and had some very, very strong words. Let's listen in.
We explained to Mr. Trump in Taormina that it would not be good for the world or the United States if America was to literally step off the world stage, because the vacuum will be filled and the Chinese are in prime position to take on a leadership role.
So there you have it, him saying that the Chinese are looking to fill in a leadership role, probably not just on climate, but on other issues as well. And as fate would have it, the Chinese Prime Minister is actually in Europe as we speak, meeting first with Europe's largest economy, with Angela Merkel of Germany, and then later with the European Union. And he had some pretty choice words as well about climate change, really central to his visit here, saying climate change is a global challenge. No country can develop outside this issue. So clearly it's a big issue here in this visit, and one where the Europeans and the Chinese are already talking about broadening cooperation, and that's certainly something that really looks as though America might be on the fringes if indeed the U.S. decides to exit that agreement, guys.
Well, if the U.S. decides, well, the U.S. didn't decide, Donald Trump decided. He wasn't elected by the majority of the American people in the first place, and it seems that even within his own cabinet there was severe debate about this. His foreign minister, that is the Secretary of State, Tillerson, formerly head of the largest oil company in the world, was in favor of staying in the accord and trying to work from within. The business community was as well around the country, but a few ideologues felt differently, and they prevailed. It's very, very interesting. Within the administration, it's the person of Scott Pruitt that seems to have prevailed upon the president. within the administration, the case seems to have been pushed by the oil state ideologue and EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt. You'll recall that he was from Oklahoma and had sued the EPA, and then he got put in charge of the EPA. He'd been in court suing the EPA several times, not just a few times, but like 14 or 15 times. And it was he who basically is trying to head up the entire effort within the government, pushing, as it says here in the headline, a government-wide effort to question climate change science. This is really quite extraordinary, pushing against the insight of tens of thousands of scientists globally. This fellow from Oklahoma, an oil state, thinks that he can sort of override this now that he's been placed in charge of the EPA. Well, it's really quite extraordinary, and the reaction was swift. Kerry was among the first to point out that Pruitt was really quite an extremist. Take a look.
Well, Scott Pruitt is an extremist, and he is an extremist who believes there is no climate change. He's one of the people who is a denier. He believes it's a hoax, and he came into office to undo specifically the progress that the country is making. It is really a stark example of the craven cynicism with which the president has approached this issue. The president is trying to tell people this is a bad deal, but the truth is that every country sets its own mark. There's nothing that has been imposed on the United States whatsoever. Each country designs its own program according to what it can achieve. And it is that flexibility, Christian, that actually made it possible to reach a 195-nation agreement after years, decades, of working on this and trying to do it. President Trump clearly is trying to appeal to a very narrow base, shoring up his base. It's clear to me that this is more political because it can't be substantive. There is no fact cited on which, and no science cited. Much of what he said with respect to the economic argument is simply not true.
There's no science behind it. The economic arguments are false. It's an ideological commitment on the part of this former administrator of Oklahoma, now in the position of being the administrator of the EPA, trying to push through, in effect, policies that will benefit his very small base, very small but very rich oil interests. Well, at the time that the president made his statement, the Washington Post actually did a fact check to try to sort of keep account of the mistakes and the misguided information that he was putting out there. It was pretty striking. In the Rose Garden, the Washington Post covered it and analyzed the talk.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. So we're getting out. But we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. China will be allowed to build hundreds of additional coal plants. So we can't build the plants, but they can. Compliance with the terms of the Paris Accord and the onerous energy restrictions it has placed on the United States could cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025. Even if the Paris Agreement were implemented in full, with total compliance from all nations, it is estimated it would only produce a 0.2 of 1 degree, think of that, this much Celsius reduction in global temperature by the year 2100. Tiny, tiny amount. As someone who cares deeply about the environment, which I do, I cannot in good conscience support a deal that punishes the United States, which is what it does.
The Washington Post, democracy dies in darkness. Doing a fact check on just a portion of the speech by the president in the Rose Garden. It's absolutely pack of lies from start to finish, and he's being fed those by the people around him, in particular Pruitt. It's not as if he knows anything independently about it. Don't worry. Trump has not learned a great deal, even from those around him. And they know virtually nothing. This is what's so embarrassing for the American posture in the world at large at this point. And in fact, President Trump's mistaken understandings and profound ignorance of climate science is laughable. Except the issue is too important for anyone to laugh. And no one is laughing around the world. They regard it as a tragedy. They start laughing, but then they realize what's at stake. Take a look.
If the world is laughing today, it's also crying. And it's a laughing, crying at the President of the United States, who clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. He really is ignorant on the issue of climate change. And regrettably, the world is going to pay a price because American leadership is important on this. It took us years of work and leadership by the United States, working very specifically with China. I mean, I would ask Donald Trump, does he think that President Xi, President Macron, that the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Chancellor of Germany, don't know what they're talking about? Are they stupid? Is he accusing them of somehow buying into a hoax? This is one of the most cynical and frankly ignorant and dangerous self-destructive steps that I've seen in my entire lifetime in public life. The President of the United States has not evidenced any science at all which documents that the moves he is making are going to make the earth safer or better. There is no economic argument whatsoever that says by the United States pulling out, we are going to advance American businesses. American business, I might add, is against what President Trump has done. The major Fortune 500 companies like ExxonMobil, our current Secretary of State's former company, many other major companies, Dow Chemical, Google, Apple, all of them are completely dismayed by this step that the president has taken. So what I want to make clear to people in the world who are listening to this, Donald Trump left this agreement. But the United States of America, represented by the mass of people who support doing something about climate change, are going to continue to take steps that will try to advance American interests and global interests to deal with this problem. And I talked yesterday with the governor of California, Jerry Brown, with the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, with the governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker. I'm glad to see the governor of Washington, who I didn't talk to, is also going to be part of an effort to continue to live by Paris. And shortly we will have a website up called livebyparis.com where people will be able to share their plans and their efforts and initiatives in order to do what President Trump is unwilling to do. But it's a sad day for American leadership. And I think it's a very, very harmful, dangerous, self-destructive step that's been taken.
A sad day for American leadership and a harmful and destructive step that's been taken, according to Kerry. Well, this continued this past month, and in fact well into the beginning of July, when the G20, that is the largest 20 economies of the world, met in Hamburg, Germany, for a meeting on strategy. And it was very interesting to see how isolated America had become throughout the world. The BBC carried a report on it this morning. G20 leaders agree, or do they? They issued a statement of agreement, but the report from the ground was quite a bit
First, let's head to
more
Hamburg,
subtle.
Germany, and that G20 summit. The leaders and their officials have been trying to come up with a final communique that manages to paper over their differences, particularly on climate change, but also on trade issues. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins is there. And James, what's the latest you're hearing?
The latest we're hearing is that they have made a breakthrough to a text that can be agreed by all, which acknowledges different positions taken up by the United States, but it is, as always with these things, something of a fudge. What's unusual this time is that there's a clear acknowledgement that there is not consensus among the G20. They like to achieve unanimity over the text of their final communiques, and they couldn't do that this time, in the sense that there's had to be language included acknowledging that, for instance, on climate change, it's a G19, if you like, plus the United States, i.e. 19 member countries are absolutely committed to the Paris Climate Change Accord, that they are re-emphasising that they intend to carry it out in full, whereas they take note of the United States' decision to pull out. What really, I think, was the sticking point was a US demand for a reference in the text to American efforts to develop fossil fuels more cleanly and efficiently, and that seemed to be undermining the Paris commitment to try to phase out fossil fuels, oil, coal and gas, in the medium to long term, something the United States has certainly not committed to. Now, somehow they found a way of squaring that circle, and that was something that Chancellor Merkel regarded as an imperative. She wanted to protect the majority commitment to Paris without seeming to give any room to others to backslide and perhaps move towards the American position. Interestingly, the Chinese President Xi, he made pointed reference to this when he had a bilateral one-to-one meeting here at the summit with the new French President Emmanuel Macron, of saying China was fully committed to carrying out the Paris Agreement in its entirety.
So in that sense, the US was left rather isolated.
Oh, I think it's been isolated on a lot of topics at this summit, and that's, if you like, a reflection of the fact that Donald Trump simply isn't really a fit in this multilateral, a good fit in this multilateral institution. After all, his America First policy is wholly at odds with the idea of negotiated multilateral global solutions. He's very, very suspicious, even hostile to such solutions. He repeatedly says that America has got some very, very bad deals in the past, and he, of course, has walked away from one of the most important of those multilateral, in fact, worldwide agreements, the one on climate change.
Right. And in addition, he managed to insult all of the members by allowing his daughter to sit in for him instead of a State Department official on several occasions, but one very important one where he was in effect absent and she sat in his place. In fact, the BBC later acknowledged that they hadn't come up with the wording for an agreement, and they had failed to bridge the climate chasm. This became clear as the U.S. became more and more isolated. Take a look at the summary.
Ever since February, U.S. President Donald Trump's domestic approval numbers have been dropping. In a Real Clear Politics average of polls, he's nearing 55% disapproval rate from Americans surveyed. And at the G20, his views also set him apart from the other 19 economies, particularly on trade and climate change. On trade, the G20 communique condemns protectionism and advocates reciprocal trade frameworks. That notion of reciprocity is something Trump regularly advocates for, The notion of protectionism is something U.S. trading partners often accuse him of supporting. The communique also makes clear that the United States stands alone in its decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. In fact, there is one paragraph devoted to American promises with respect to climate and a separate one for the other 19 members. They agree that the Paris Agreement is irreversible.
It's very interesting to see at the end of the meeting, Trump isn't even there. It's Putin and the head of the Asian economies, in this case Korea, that are talking to one another, and Putin's not even in the room. Trump is not even in the room. Putin's there, and the discussion has completely sidelined the Americans. They're isolated in what used to be their strongest allied group. Following the meeting, Tillerson took off right away and, very interesting, went to Ukraine. The reason is that there seems to be an effort to try to get U.S. gas sales.
President Trump put gas at the top of the business agenda in Poland.
America stands ready to help Poland and other European nations diversify their energy supplies so that you can never be held hostage to a single supplier.
That's the key. Poland and other European nations in their energy supplies, including the Ukraine, which had experienced a holdup on the delivery of natural gas from the Russians several years ago.
Up to now, that supplier has been Russia. State-owned Russian firm Gazprom shut off pipelines to Ukraine in 2015, depriving Kiev of a major source of revenue and disrupting supplies to Eastern Europe.
Well, that's been the behind-the-scenes action. The U.S., in effect, is on a collision course in competition with Russia for who's going to supply natural gas to the Ukraine and to Poland. As far as climate is concerned, it's the U.S. and UK versus Germany and China at this point. It's the way it was summed up in the headlines. The two-day Hamburg summit shows a real breakdown of the alliance. This is why there's an urgent need now for a new kind of citizen science alliance around the world to work together to devise a transition to a sustainable future.